Ladies and gentlemen, if Rembrandt would have died in 1630, he would be remembered as a highly talented young artist from Leiden who left behind a number of mostly small-size history paintings executed in a rather fine painterly style. Furthermore, his interest in depicting himself in some painted as well as etched self-portraits would not have gone unnoticed. It is likely that Rembrandt's highly important contribution to portrait painting would not even be mentioned. This is understandable because until his arrival in Amsterdam in 1631, he did not, as far as we know, produce a single portrait depicting an individual outside maybe his own family. The implication of this is that he apparently did not receive commissions to paint portraits during his Leiden period. This is remarkable because even before moving to Amsterdam, he had already experimented successfully with the depiction of the human physiognomy in some study heads, the so-called tronies, as well as in his self-portraits. Fortunately, Rembrandt did not die in 1630 and was able to prove within the following 4 decennia until his death in 1669 his unrivaled talent to depict many of his contemporaries in highly sophisticated and most-speaking portraits. To what degree he really liked to paint portraits is open to speculation. There are, however, some indications that Rembrandt during his career developed a kind of hate-love when it came to paint portraits, and that the production of portraits, not surprisingly, was often related to his financial situation. In the traditional hierarchy of paintings, since the Renaissance, portraits were ranked rather low in comparison with, for example, history paintings. Rembrandt's contemporaries regarded the sheer painting of portraits from life as merely a side road of the arts, an important exercise, but unworthy for a true history painter. Rembrandt's pupil Samuel van Hoogstraten explains in 1678 in his Introduction to the Academy of Painting that painting is not a craft, and he urges painters not to restrict themselves to one specialism, but to become a, quote, universal or general master, who should be capable to depict all elements of the visible world, which includes the painting of the human likeness in portraits. When talking about painting portraits, Van Hoogstraten makes a difference between those painters who succeeded in copying the face of the sitter realistically through, quote, imitating eyes, nose, and mouth in a skillful manner. However, only those painters achieve the utmost who can also depict the, quote, contemplations or human soul. But Van Hoogstraten also admits that painting portraits is related to gaining material goods. Money makes the world go round. According to him, the painter should earn 3 different rewards for his work: the satisfaction of his mind through perfection of his work, secondly, reputation, and thirdly, benefit in the form of material goods. In the allegorical depiction of these rewards on the sides of his perspective box in London's National Gallery, Van Hoogstraten relates the benefits to portrait painters. The Putto, wearing a crown and a scepter, is leaning, you can see this in the upper right corner, the Putto is leaning on a cornucopia full of coins. Money makes the world go round. In the right background, we see a young painter in front of his easel with a portrait of a woman. The banderole shows the inscription lucri causa, referring to the material aspects of the art of painting. We don't know exactly where and when Rembrandt and the art dealer Hendrik Eulenburg met each other for the first time. But there can hardly be any doubt that the two knew each other quite well before Rembrandt moved in with Eulenburg and joined his workshop. The art dealer Eulenburg, a Mennonite, had a wide-ranging network with connections to Poland and Antwerp, as well as to members of his own and other denominations. It seems that Eulenburg was willing to take a certain risk when engaging Rembrandt, who in Leiden had painted only small-size history paintings, some self-portraits, and tronies. But apparently, Eulenburg was confident and believed in the young artist. Because of his early history paintings, which Rembrandt produced in Leiden and later in Amsterdam, it has always been assumed that right from the beginning of his career, Rembrandt wanted to be a history painter. It must, however, been clear to him in 1631 that becoming a successful history painter in Amsterdam would be much easier by attracting potential buyers of his history paintings after having established himself as an outstanding portrait painter. And that was exactly what Eulenburg was looking for. Although the portrait genre was new to Rembrandt, already the first efforts must have astounded the Amsterdam public. The 1631 life-size portrait of Nicholas Rutz, to your left, does not show any indication that it is the work of a beginner within the portrait genre. The same is true of his portrait of Martin Lohten of 1632, here to your right. Through the dynamic pose, the penetrating gaze, the lively physiognomy, and the intense lighting, the sitters show a strong physical presence, typical for Rembrandt, but unknown in Amsterdam portrait before his arrival. Eulenburg had betted on the right horse. Rembrandt immediately took the leading role in Amsterdam and was the most sought-after portrait painter between 1631 and 1635. During this time, he painted close to 50 portraits. The clientele for these portraits were very diverse and included craftsmen, merchants, officers, and clergymen from a variety of denominations. Rembrandt painted life-size, full-length, as well as three-quarter and bust-length portraits. Here, the two portraits of Martin Solmons and Opium Coppet of 1634, only recently shared acquisition by the Amsterdam Rijksmuseum and the Louvre in Paris. But he also painted, highly fashionable around this time, the oval as a kind of rather common format for portraits here, the young woman in the portrait in Euston, 1633. The great demand for portraits very likely led to the participation of assistants in the execution of some portraits, which was common practice in other workshops too. When in 1641, Jan Ohlers, the first biographer of Rembrandt, published the second edition of his History of Leiden, he specifically mentioned that, quote, Rembrandt's art and work very much pleased the burghers and inhabitants of Amsterdam, and it was there that he was often asked to paint either portraits or other works, end of quote. However, leaving Eulenburg's workshop in 1635 brought a remarkable change in Rembrandt's production of portraits. Brought a remarkable change in Rembrandt's production of portraits. It seems that he almost immediately stopped with painting portrait paintings, turning to ambitious history paintings like The Blinding of Samson of 1636. There are, however, very few exceptions, like the 1637 portrait of the Eleazar Svalmius to the left, a clergyman in Amsterdam and Schiedam. It was only in 1639, and Bas Dudok van Heer had explained to us about the painting that Rembrandt painted the Andries de Graaf, a member of one of the most powerful regent families of Amsterdam. Rembrandt apparently was asking huge prices for his portraits because a dispute between him and de Graaf concerning the payment for the portrait went on until 1642. Hendrik Uylenburg acted as a mediator and estimated the portrait worth 500 guilders, a huge amount of money for a painting. Rembrandt, apparently, as we just heard, had apparently asked even more. His increased production, not only of portraits, must have had to do with the purchase of the house which he acquired in the same year and the down payment for it. Rembrandt was in need of money. However, he did not turn to run-of-the-mill portraits, but experimented, as usually, with new ideas and solutions. Brilliant examples are the double portraits of Agatha Bass and her husband Nicholas van Barmbek from 1641. The optical illusions with the painted black picture frame and the gloves and fan create an impression of the figures sharing the same space with the viewer. The painting technique is restrained and refined from smooth to the application of a rather visible impasto, which creates a subtle sfumato effect and contributes to a strong illusionism. How did Rembrandt receive the commission to paint the pendants of van Barmbek and his wife? It is likely that he knew the husband already from his time in Uylenburg's workshop, because van Barmbek lived in the same street, and in 1640 both Rembrandt and van Barmbek, a year before these were painted, belonged to the group of people who lent money to Uylenburg for his art trade. After finishing the Night Watch in 1642, Rembrandt obviously stopped painting portraits for almost 8 years. The one exception is the small, very fluently executed portrait of the Jewish physician and poet Ephraim Hezekiah Bueno. The painting probably served as a modello or a recorder of the etched portrait of Bueno of 1647, an etching that you actually can see in the exhibition. Rembrandt produced portraits in the 1640s, but exclusively as etchings like the one of Jan Six in 1647, another one which is included into the exhibition upstairs. The lack of painted portraits between 1642 and 1650-51 can hardly be explained with the lack of commissions. Apparently, it was Rembrandt himself who deliberately decided not to accept assignments for painted portraits during this time. Why is hard to answer. Economically, these years were apparently solid, with sufficient financial reserves. However, after years of prosperity, it became clear in 1653 that Rembrandt was in financial problems. He started taking out large loans from acquaintances, among them Jan Six, to whom he had already sold a number of paintings, including a portrait of his wife Saskia today in Kassel, and the Berlin John the Baptist preaching. And not surprisingly, around 1652, Rembrandt again took up portrait painting. In comparison with his sitters in the 1630s, however, his clients, his clientele had changed. Many of them were people to whom Rembrandt had a personal or professional connection, for example, art lovers, art dealers, and other painters. This seems to confirm what Arnold Houbraken wrote in 1718 about Rembrandt. Quote, "In the autumn of his life, he mostly kept the company of common people and those practiced art. There was no shortage of commissions, and Rembrandt very likely did not actively look for new clients, although his increasingly dark painting style differed greatly from the changing style preferred by the average clients for portraits, something that is wonderfully illustrated in the exhibition. It was again Houbraken who wrote about Rembrandt's former pupil Nicolas Maas that he soon stopped painting in the style of his master, Rembrandt, because, quote, he realized that especially the young ladies felt more comfortable with white than with brown, end of quote. And also Govert Flink, with whom Rembrandt had worked together in Eilenburg's workshop, gave up following Rembrandt's style when, according to Houbraken, quote, bright painting became fashionable again. Rembrandt had never conformed to the fashionable, smooth and bright new portrait style. He single-mindedly, almost stubbornly, continued his, to a certain degree, experimental painting style and searched for new artistic solutions which he found interesting and which apparently were accepted by at least some connoisseurs. Connoisseurs like the wealthy Amsterdam art lover Jan Six, who commissioned his portrait etching from Rembrandt in 1647, we've just seen it, but had to wait until around 1654 before the artist painted his portrait. It is the looseness of his brushwork that is the distinct feature of the portrait. At the same time, the painting technique is highly differentiated, subtle in the face, sketch-like in the gloves, wet in the yellow braiding of his cloak, and fluent in his cuffs. New is that the play of hands contribute to the liveliness of the portrait and attract the viewer's attention, unlike in Rembrandt's portraits of the 1630s, where the hands very often only played a secondary role. The portrait of a man with hat and gloves and the portrait of a lady with an ostrich feather fan, upstairs in the exhibition of 1655, around 1655 from the National Gallery in Washington, were recently identified by Marieke de Winkel as Hermann Aubréby and his wife Maria von Sinnig. Both, as I said, both paintings are in the exhibition here. Especially the portrait of the man compares nicely with the portrait of Jan Six. It shows the same new approach to the depiction of hands and the use of the hat to cast a shade over the eyes of the sitter, something that is very common for portraits of Rembrandt in the 1650s. He experimented with this new way of combining light with shade in the face of his sitters. Furthermore, the format of the three paintings, so the Jan Six and these two, are almost square. It seems as if Rembrandt in the 1650s used the square format in order to increase the concentration on the physiognomy of his sitters. You can actually observe this as well when you look upstairs in the exhibition at a series of etchings Rembrandt produced in the 1650s. Even in the etchings, you have the kind of idea that the format is getting more square than really kind of vertical oblong. There is, as far as we know, no direct link between Aubréby, his wife, and Rembrandt. What we do know, however, is that Aubréby's cousin, Cornelis Wilmerdonck, in 1642, owned a double portrait of himself and his wife painted by Rembrandt. The painting apparently is lost, but might have been the reason also for Aubréby to finally turn to Rembrandt after having realized that the painter has taken up portrait painting again. A wonderful human note talking about the identification of Maria Sinnig, painting to your right is that has always become very obvious, was always kind of remarkable, the kind of melancholy around her gaze and her face. And Marike found the year of her death, and it seemed that this painting must have been immediately before her death, and we know that she had been sick for quite a while. I don't want to get into the kind of psychological interpretation of portraits, but I think if you look at her and realize that she died in 1655, and these paintings, from the point of costume and from the point of style, must have been painted immediately before 1655, it becomes obvious that there is something going on. Let's go to this. In 1656, Rembrandt painted the portrait of the poet Jeremias de Dekker. In 1660, in one of his publications, the poet thanked Rembrandt for his portrait, which he has received as, quote, a gift and favor. The two evidently were friends. De Dekker's portrait was painted by Rembrandt without commission. It shows the same effect of the head casting shade over the eyes of the figure, like in the Aubrey portrait Rembrandt painted around the same time, a little earlier. That Rembrandt, towards the end of his career, painted portraits of either people he had known for quite a while or sitters who were connected with the Amsterdam art scene is also confirmed by the portrait of the painter, engraver, and art theorist Gérard de Léresse of around 1665-67, which is today in the Metropolitan Museum in New York. In conclusion, Rembrandt used the production of portraits in an almost strategical way, depending on the different personal and artistic circumstances of his career. In the beginning, to establish himself on a new and competitive market. He almost abandoned it when he turned to new challenges as a history painter. And finally, he took it up when the financial pressure grew, which led to his bankruptcy. Whatever reasons he had to accept commissions for portraits, Rembrandt never executed them by simply applying a certain repetitive routine. Painting portraits was throughout his career a creative and demanding process which can be compared to his history paintings. Rembrandt remained, even in his portraits, a storyteller who successfully told the story of many individual lives. Thank you very much.